Welcome back to Kettle Additions. This is Austin McElroy. I'm the master brewer of Cabin Boys Brewery, and today I'm alone, but I am going to share you stories about stouts, the beer that has shaped and churned out lots of different variations of the style throughout the ages, going back all the way to the 1700s to impress the Tsarina of Russia, which would then birth the imperial stout that we all know today, which is the robust, high ABV stout that swept America, taking on a new adventure into what the stout ale category meant to the world. So, first, let me take you into the realm of my journey in writing recipes. So, I hadn't necessarily written true commercial recipes at this time. I am in Munich, Germany at school, and we are, as a class, imposed to write recipes and enter them into the 2016 World Brewing Academy competition, which would be judged by the best judges in the world at the end of the school year to see whom amongst our group would produce the best beer in the class of year 2016. I am in a small town just outside of Salzburg, Austria, and we are brewing at a brewery called Trumer, which is a beautiful brewery that has this landscape that looks out over a lake, and in the background is the Austrian Alps. So this place is dreamy, and they are very well known for their lagers. Now, me being a new person integrated into the craft beer world, I wanted to make something in this imposing lager world, the most opposite thing that you could think of, which would be an imperial stout. So, we have to present our recipes to our headmaster before brewing it in these breweries that we were allowed to experiment with and learn from. And Trumer had welcomed us into their house and into their test batch system at their brew pub, or what you would call their tap room outside of their main facility. We obviously didn't get to brew beer on their commercial batch system because Lord knows putting a humble student's recipe into a 200 barrel fermenter is not necessarily something that they're going to take on. So we're brewing on a very old, what seems to be a 100-year-old homebrew system or a brew pub system. And it's 1 barrels, so it's 31 gallons large. And they have equipped this basement, which is just a open playground for a brewer. They have their copper kettle over an open fire boil kettle and mash tun that we got to brew on, and Lord knows it probably was over 100 years old, and transferred into a fermentation cellar that is identically created and engineered to be just like we were fermenting on their 200 barrel system, just on 1 barrel. So it was a open fermenter, which means that the top of the fermenter is open to the elements, which allows the yeast to move freely, a little bit more freely, and create an abundance of esters. Now, this isn't necessarily the part of my recipe that I was intrigued about, though I do believe that it created a much more full-bodied and wonderfully flavored beer. I presented this recipe of an imperial stout to my headmaster with a group of guys that would become the foundation of Felix et Tenebris, our wonderful imperial stout that our customers have loved for the last 6 years. The different thing or the different idea that I had in mind was creating a wonderfully balanced and robust imperial stout that would also be playful and very drinkable. So you can do this in a numerous amount of ways, though the way that I was going to do it was take a little bit of knowledge or a little bit of expertise from the Swiss chocolatiers. I had noticed in my travels that the Swiss chocolatiers were adding citrus into their chocolate. And when you would eat a bar of this chocolate with citrus in it, the chocolate aromas were cut and made more playful. And I had this grandiose idea that if they could do this counterbalance of experience while eating chocolate to alleviate the bitterness and the heaviness of chocolate, then why wouldn't that work in a stout? My theory was that if we added orange juice into a stout, then we could drop the acidic value of the liquid and create a more crisp and enjoyable beer that was still high ABV and on the front end be the robust and chocolatey, thick beer that everybody loves and calls an imperial stout. But when you would swallow, the acidic value of the beer would relieve the palate and relieve the stomach of its heaviness. Now, my headmaster being very curious, we didn't necessarily know how we were going to introduce this citrus into the beer. My idea was to introduce it into the boil so that from the very birth of the liquid, the acid level would be already at a reduced manner. So when going through fermentation, the yeast would take this liquid that we had made, which is called wort before it becomes beer, would stay below a 4.2 pH level and probably fall into the 3.9. Now, that is so going from 4.2, which normal beers live in, you want your beer to go below 4.6 for safety and for flavor profile. You start getting below 4.2 and going definitely below 4, and you might even taste a little bit of tartness. But my theory was, with as much residual sugar in a stout that there is, that the counterbalance of the leftover sugar would alleviate the consciousness or the ability to actually taste the tartness that the citrus would impede on the liquid. We concocted from a grocery store next door to this brew pub that Trumer had of a lot of citrus fruit, and we didn't have a way to properly juice the fruit. So what we did was we went down to the convenience store after buying our citrus and buying uninked pantyhose and stuffing pantyhose with copious amounts of oranges and introducing these oranges into the later part of the boil. We didn't want to boil off all of the aroma of the orange, but we didn't want the pulp. We wanted it to be clean and transferable into the fermenter without all of the organic matter that citrus brings to the table. Lo and behold, this wildly different idea at the time worked. It fermented out and came out into the keg and was this beautiful dance in between this robust imperial stout that was very thick and enjoyable, one that you could drink around a fire, but when you consumed it, your palate and stomach were alleviated from the notion that this was a really heavy beer. Now, we didn't find any aromatics necessarily in this first rendition of what would then become Felix et Tenebris, that we would serve at Cabin Boys later on down the road. We didn't find any aromatics of the orange juice. Now, as much as I have tried in from subsequent years of brewing this beer, have found out that no matter how much citrus that I bring to the table, I haven't really found a very robust aroma character from the citrus. Just a more and more acidic value and a lighter bodied beer when I add more citrus to the stout. This was an enamoring find and discovery for me and my school. And lo and behold, after the judges go through all of their judging at the end of the school year, they deem what would become Felix et Tenebris the number one beer of the World Brewing Academy 2016 beers made at school, which was really cool. We took this wild, cockeyed idea with a really, we would call it a pretty traditional imperial stout recipe to create this wonderfully balanced and more drinkable experience within a style that has been around since the 1700s. It was a really cool experience. It was a really wonderful example of how you can take science and artistry and match them together and create what would then become one of Tulsa's most beautifully drunk and experienced beers and stouts in the market. If you talk about stouts, you can't talk about how the morphology and history of that beer has come to play. At this time when I'm making this weirdly even ornate idea of introducing orange juice into a stout was not a new idea of adding an adjunct into stouts. They are a style that accepts flavor and aroma and dances very playfully with the complex malt and hop aromatics that go into it. These beers that we know as stouts are extremely accepting of wild ingredients that never before have been put into a beer. So you rewind the history books back to 1700s when England is making the first imperial stouts to impress the Tsarina of Russia. Um, I believe her name is Christina. Um, and they were trying to impress her and sending very high ABV beers into a very desolate, cold world so that they could warm their bellies through the winter and enjoy drinking beer year round. So, stouts were born out of the porter, which is at the time a more alcoholic workman's beer. So it was a higher octane beer that would warm the bellies of the portman. So these would be the guys coming off of the ports in the dead of winter, wanting to come into the taverns and warm their spirits with a very robust beer. So that would be the beginnings of how stouts morphed into what they are. They come from porters and were born into this imperialistic style that was made with the most the highest grade shelf grain and the best ingredients that they could find at the time. Porters start to die out because stouts become wildly popular and take over the UK islands and fall over into the Irish Isles and pretty much snub out the porter because this was a style that had more robust aromatics, it had more alcohol content to it, and it fingers into a lot of different areas. So if you go over into Ireland, you're going to see more drinkable and lighter stouts and lighter ABVs. So 4.5% is the average alcohol content of an Irish stout. And that's because they were making these beers for the common man. They weren't making them for the imperial courts. They were wanting this beer to be drunk by the masses, and thus the more sessionable stout is born outside of this wave of dark and opaque beer style that swept throughout the northern isles of Europe. So this swings over into America, and you've got a mixing of the two. You've got the very drinkable stouts that we know and love today that come out of the birth of the relationship of the stout in Ireland and England that would be made more for the common man. And fast forward into the 1980s when the craft beer world takes storm. Craft brewers take hold of this story in the 1980s and crank up the ABV of the beer again. We're talking through the threshold of way beyond 10%. We took Imperial Russian stouts to the next level. We added more hops into them. We added more malt and chocolate malts to increase aromatics and thickness in the pint. So we have this explosion of alcohol driven and aromatic driven movement throughout the craft beer world. This is not new knowledge to you guys that are listening. We, as a craft beer industry, were wanting to push the envelope on every style imaginable. So that meant throwing more hops into IPAs and making them unbearably bitter and more pushing the envelope on aromatics. We were doing the same thing in the stout world. We were throwing more malt and more chocolate character and more coffee notes from the malts. And then the pages turn over into a new area of adjuncts. We start adding sugar to get more ABV. We start adding donuts. We start adding fruits. We start adding pastries into stouts. And thus, the coin of the pastry stout is born. And this is something extremely explosive and exciting. This is in the time when people are finding out that you can actually have a beer that's over 14% with all of these ingredients that match so well with the chocolatey and coffee aromatics of the malt within the stout. And we just start pumping as many things into the beer as possible. And this wonderful overarching creativity within the stout world bleeds over into many different styles of beer, but focusing on why stouts accept this wild array of adjuncts. And remember, if you're saying adjuncts, that's anything outside of the four ingredients that define beer. So we're talking anything outside of those. We find out, as all of humankind has, that when you add wonderful aromatics to a substance that accepts them, it is going to be extremely popular and explosive and trendy with the times. So we see the pastry stout be born and all of that creativity go out into the world. You name it, it's been in a stout. All the way from fried chicken to donuts. So we come into this pinnacle of turn of events of taking a beer that was born in the 1700s to push the envelope to impress a czar of Russia over into America, into the craft beer boom, which we find out that we can push the envelope even further. Then you come into the last 4 or 5 years. Stouts are still one of the top contenders of the craft beer industry. We have defined this style and enshrouded it with this beautiful and pedestal like idea of what a stout is supposed to be. It can be something so complex and so rich. And then what we have noticed in the industry is people bringing it back into its more historical manner and more simplified aromas, because the stout in and of itself is a wonderful tasting beer that can be enjoyed by itself. So I think, in my own definition of how tables have turned, is the stout is always going to be a stout. It's going to be this thick, mysterious, wonderful liquid that people talk about for ages because of its intriguing manner of high alcohol or low alcohol, and exemplifying the malt aromatics of what can be exemplified within a recipe. When talking about stouts, in all of its history, we have found out that there are American stouts, there's Irish stouts, there's English stouts, there's Russian imperial stouts, there's all these different definitions ranging from 4.5% all the way up to 15%. This wonderful style is so complex and so vastly different that it hits the table and can be enjoyed by every individual on planet Earth, in my opinion. There is a stout out there on tap somewhere that can find its way onto everybody's palate and be enjoyed. You can talk about how Guinness, one of the misunderstandings of what Guinness is. I hear this terminology of like, well, I don't like Guinness because it's so thick. Well, actually, the reason that that beer is so popular is because of how non-thick it is. And it is one of the most drinkable stouts on planet Earth. And one of the reasons why I wanted to make a higher ABV stout, but still as drinkable as a Guinness. The reason that Guinness is so drinkable is it's born out of an Irish red and then colored in the boil kettle with some coloring malt. It's designed to be a beer drunk in the masses. And it only has this thick definition because it's technically flat. It's a nitrous beer, and nitrogen can't stay in liquid. And the beauty of their marketing and their story driven ability to sell this mysterious Guinness stout has led people to mystify its storyline and how thick it is or how it gives you health. And but in the end, it is just a wonderfully balanced beer that people just love to drink day in, day out. And that is what we've seen at Cabin Boys Brewery is when we make a stout, and we have just made our Brick Lane stout for the winter time or the early winter time. And this seasonal style of beer is just sought out after because of its thick warmingness in your body that allows you to come to the table with friends and enjoy a more complex conversation or let you dive into the mystified realm of where and how stouts morph your mind at the table. I feel like we're transformed or transferred into a different realm when a stout is at the table, not because of its explosive manner of aromatics, but it brings us to a more carnal version of humanity and brings us into the warmth of a tavern when outside is so cold. It brings our minds back into this survival mode of I am having this comfort in a glass with friends around a fire or around a warm bar that we love to frequent. And we have found, Brick Lane is a low ABV stout for what we would call a stout. And it is wildly one of the more popular beers in our tap room at this time. Do I think that we could sell as much stout as we would in the summer as we are now? Absolutely not. Because it is so seasonal. It brings us together during the dark and damp months. It brings warmth back into our life. And I think that that is the reason why we're so tied to this style. It allows us to break away from the cold, dark, and uh, the cold, dark days that we're battling throughout these long, long, dark days, and allows us to bring into this warmth of a glass. We're going to release our Felix et Tenebris in a couple of weeks from now, and it is because our customers have been begging for it to come back. And that is such a special thing when people want something because of nostalgia or because it reminds them of a conversation that they had earlier on around something that brought that moment from within them. Not because the beer is what it is. The beer is an excellent and wonderful product. Most stouts are. But I think the reason that stouts are so mystified and have so much nostalgia in our mind is because we get to hunker together around table and experience these once in a lifetime niche moments around a glass of beer with our friends, telling stories of days gone past and enjoying something that has brought the world together for many a age. And so, thus concludes my story of the stout. The stout is a beer that brings together people during this long and arduous battle of winter. And why it's such a seasonal style is because it brings us warmth in the darkest of times and allows us to enjoy special moments together through its mystified thickness and ABV, and allows us to get out of our own mental state and break through these arduous times of winter and celebrate who we are together around tables. And that, my friends, is my definition of why stouts have stamped their existence into humankind for eternity. Thank you so much for listening to these not so random stories from me. It is really fun for myself to be able to dig into my own history and tell you stories of why certain styles have become what they have become from a brewer's perspective, and allow you into my own mind and why I get so excited and so enthralled when we get to release a new beer or bring back a old favorite such as Felix and celebrate those moments with you. So, if you like hearing these stories, please subscribe, please leave a rating, and if you like it, please tell a friend about it. I am going to be trying to tell these stories and bring on really interesting guests to shine a little bit of light and a little bit of knowledge into this ever-growing and complex industry that you know as the craft beer industry, and as a very historical industry as we know it in the human kind on planet Earth for the last 10,000 years. Find this podcast wherever you listen to your podcast: iHeartRadio, YouTube, Spotify. Go find it, rate it, subscribe to it. If you absolutely hate it, don't listen to it again, but still tell your friends to go listen to it. So thank you very much. This is Kettle Additions with Austin McElroy. Tune in next week. I'll be bringing on a guest. Thank you.